Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Biella Coleman is a full professor in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University and is also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Mora Matassi, doctoral candidate at Northwestern University and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Biella in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and institutions' history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, and community service and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly just a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mora will tell us more about Biella's research and career in just a few seconds. Then Biella will present her work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Mora will moderate. You can do that at any point in time during the talk. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mora, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you for having me as moderator for today's edition of the virtual seminar series. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Biella Coleman is full professor in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University and faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Trained as an anthropologist, her scholarship covers the politics, cultures, and ethics of hacking. She is the author of 2 books on computer hackers and the founder and editor of Hack Curio, a video portal into the cultures of hacking. Professor Coleman's first book, Coding Freedom, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking, was published in 2013 with Princeton University. She then published Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous, published by Verso in 2014, which was named to Kirkus Review's Best Books of 2014 and awarded the Diana Forsyth Prize by the American Anthropological Association. With Matt Gerson, she is currently completing a multi-year research project on the security field and hacker professionalization during the 1990s and early 2000s, and will be publishing two data and society reports based on this research. This year, 2022, Professor Coleman delivered one of the Henry Morgan lectures on anonymous hacktivism versus QAnon. She is a frequent commentator on hacker movements, digital culture, and cyber politics, and has written for popular media outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, Wired, MIT Technology Review, Huffington Post, and The Atlantic. In 2011, Professor Coleman was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and her research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the National Science Foundation, and the Fonds de Recherche du Québec. Before joining the Harvard Anthropology Department in 2021, Professor Coleman held the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University and was an assistant professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. In 2005, she received her PhD in social-cultural anthropology from the University of Chicago. In today's presentation, Professor Coleman will unveil the prehistory and history of the hack and leak tactic, focusing in the prominent role played by the hacktivist collective Anonymous. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Coleman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Maura, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Pablo, to you and the Center for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be able to share this work. Let me share my screen, and then I will get started. Okay. All right. I think that looks good. So as Maura indicated, I am talking about the hack and leak and its prehistory. I've sort of changed the title to the provenance of the hack and leak and why it matters. This essay is part of a collection of essays I'm writing that were based on the Henry Morgan lectures. And the essays are from different time periods and places, all covering hacking. And in certain regards, I'm trying to use the essays to kind of complicate the idea that there's any kind of essence to the politics of hacking. But let me just kind of dive in with the talk. Okay. In early October of this year, a hacktivist group, Guacamaya, or the Macas, hacked Mexico's defense ministry and leaked an astronomical 6 terabytes of data, much of it email. Like many hacks and leaks, this one qualified as a newsworthy event just because of the hack, but it also doubled as a source of material for journalists writing stories in the public interest. Indeed, in this case, journalists found evidence that the military uses spyware to track and surveil journalists. They have sold grenades to the cartels and stonewalled investigators seeking to solve the heinous 2000 murder disappearance of 43 male students. This hack and leak is but one of dozens that are now so common that many journalists who cover hackers and this tactic believe it has existed long before it did, before the period between 2009 and 11, when the tactic really took off. I want to now show you 2 slides of instances of the hack and leak, one after 2010 and one before, so you can see the difference in terms of the prevalence of the hack and leak. So this is a kind of partial list from 2010 to the present. I'm not going to read through every one of them, but as you can see, there's quite a few of them. And then here you'll see that before 2010, I've kind of identified 4 of them. And there may be more, but I think if there are, they're not very well known. So now used by hacktivists, nation states, and even ransomware groups. Today, I'm going to sketch the prehistory, and I'm going to cover some of the ones that are in the slides. I'm going to look at its stabilization, its propagation, and its mutations. Now, my core historical argument is pretty straightforward. The tactic first really deployed in 2009 in a very deliberate way, only stabilized in 2011, and was indeed indebted almost entirely to the hacktivists known as Anonymous. And what I think is also really interesting about this history is that even though Anonymous was centrally involved in kind of the proliferation of this tactic, they kind of stumbled upon it quite accidentally. So my argument is that even though they accidentally stumbled upon hacking and leaking, they did so during a time when hacktivists of different kinds commanded the main stage of history. With Anonymous and their very different cousins, WikiLeaks, hackers pushed the levers of powers far more consequentially, making hacks and leaks the stuff of foreign policy briefs and international relation debates and debacles. Anonymous is social media savvy, and their very, very visible brand of hacking lured in media professionals who boosted their profile and by extension raised the profile of this mode of disclosure, ensuring that scattered instances of this method would crystallize into a template for emulation. Now, none of this may be particularly surprising. After all, hackers hack, hackers leak. But what fascinates me about this history are two things. First, as I had mentioned earlier, it has become so common and so naturalized that those journalists most familiar with this tactic believe it has existed prior to the 2010s. And perhaps they believe this, and this is the second thing that interests me, is because it was actually materially and to some extent ideologically possible for this tactic to have existed much earlier, certainly prior to 2009 and 10. And yet no one thought to hack and leak. But let me now tell you why it was actually materially as well as ideologically possible to do this. So for much of the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the early 2000s, hundreds, if not thousands of hackers, largely in North America, Europe, and Australia, were part of a thriving underground hacker scene composed of active and secretive groups going by the names of the Hacker's Choice, Tezo, ADM, and many more. These hackers intruded into and commanded network computer systems of all kinds, and they did so usually for fun and learning. They were not malicious, criminally oriented hackers, even if they broke the law. They accessed, well, most everything housed on these servers, including documents and emails. Sometimes they took this material to show it and share it with their fellow hackers, either as proof of a hack or as a status trophy. But before 2010, hackers rarely published or shared such material for outside groups, much less with a motive to showcase corruption or to give to journalists, as is common today. If and when underground hackers publicly released emails, and they did so on occasion in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was done selectively to embarrass the heck out of a fellow hacker who chose to leave the underground and go pro, hackers who professionalized and sought jobs in the security industry. A history I've written about, and this is a copy of the article I co-wrote with Matt Gorzen on this topic. Indeed, one hacker I interviewed for that other project on the professionalization of the hacker underground explained that while his group held access to email servers in the 1990s used by several powerful, even famous people, no one ever seriously considered delving into the emails for evidence of malfeasance or corruption. This is what he told me during the interview. I wish we had done something about it, but we didn't. I think we could have exposed a lot of corruption and a lot of wrongdoing of a lot of high-profile political people. Most hackers I interviewed who were part of this 1990s, 2000 scene also affirmed and confirmed it never occurred to them that their hacking could double as an act of whistleblowing. Such a tactic was not part of their mental map of possibilities. Now, granted, most hackers part of this underground scene were not really ideologically predisposed to hack for activism or politics. But in this era, there were also other hacktivists breaking into computers, into sites, often largely for the purpose of website defacements, changing the front page of a web page with a political message. And they could enter into different parts of the computer system, but they didn't think either to steal documents for whistleblowing. These social facts about crucial absences, about what was not even politically imaginable, signals how mere material access to systems and emails was insufficient for spurring the imagination and creating the conditions needed for the political hacktivist commitment of hacking and leaking to take hold. This disjuncture between what's materially possible and what actually transpires, that is how novel social things, in this case, a political tactic, come into being, how people whip up new political possibilities, and the ways that they're subsequently taken up, understood, and misunderstood, that forms these questions form the conceptual heart of this talk. So now what I'm going to do is give a genealogy of this tactic, and then I'm going to end with the implications. And I'm going to actually start with an example that's in the pre-digital era that may be a little bit surprising, but I do think it's part of this genealogy. And it's an example I'm going to return to in my conclusion as well. So how did we get here, and what are the precursors? So before mass digitization, documents tend to be on paper, and if well organized, neatly filed away in cream-colored folders with labels in a filing cabinet. Most stolen documents used for public interest reporting were taken by insiders with relatively easy access to them, such as Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. But there is one important exception of an outsider group of activists, which in this case is a group going by the name the Citizens Commission to Expose the FBI, who successfully broke into a building in 1971 and left with suitcases full of stolen documents. They sent over the documents to various journalists, including Betty Metzger at the Washington Post. And here's a quote. In March 1971, Betty Metzger, then a reporter of the Washington Post, received from anonymous sources copies of files stolen from the Media, Pennsylvania FBI office the night of March 8, 1971. Now, this affair prefigures the hack and leak. And more crucially, it helps shatter and then rebuild some journalistic norms of the time. For the very first time, an establishment paper in the United States published secret and stolen government documents. Again, in this case, by anonymous outsiders who broke into a building. However, what interests me about this history is that it almost did not happen. As Metzger was preparing a story based on the files, Katharine Graham, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, and the Post legal counsel were on the verge of tossing out the entire story, primarily on the grounds that reporting on secret files that had been stolen had never been done before, and it was likely to be considered highly questionable ethically and legally. However, they did decide to move forward with the stories, and it was quite consequential. The initial batch of documents did reveal extensive FBI surveillance. And one phrase in the documents, COINTELPRO, was used by another journalist a few years later to FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, request more documents. And COINTELPRO, which was a secret government program to kind of dismantle various activist groups in the United States, this program was also revealed. And indeed, if the Washington Post and other newspapers had decided not to publish on stolen documents, this might have never happened. Now, there are very few instances of actual physical break-ins to get documents to leak them. So I really don't know of others. And so now I'm going to kind of move on in my genealogy and consider some precursors to the hack and leak through the vantage point of two email and document dumps that occurred not through hacks, but I still think were quite similar to the hack and leak. So one concerns the Diebold voting machine documents, and the other concerns the Enron Energy email corpus. And I'll get to them in a moment, but they were not acquired, as I mentioned, by hacks and leaks, but they were used for some reporting. And I think they're also important because even if these weren't obtained by hacks, the two cases made it more apparent that such digital information might be out there for the taking. And I also think that what's really interesting about these two cases is that it was really, really, really difficult to convince journalists of the newsworthiness of this information. So we'll start here with Bev Harris. So on February 4th, 2003, employees of the Diebold election system admitted they had been using an insecure FTP server to exchange and update some part of the Diebold software. Bev Harris, who was concerned about security vulnerabilities in voting machines, was doing a Google search, and she had discovered the server during the search, and she wrote it up in a kind of online journal called Scoop, She took all the information, she started to work with a computer science professor, and they found many vulnerabilities and problems with the software. Her initial attempt to drum up journalistic interest by sending more than 1,000 bulletins directly to appropriate editors and producers flopped. Journalists were uninterested. Later in the year, spurred by additional research enabled by the documents and the technical details, the New York Times finally ran an exclusive story on the stunning research flaws in the debold system. So this was in the early 2000s, and another similar case, which happened in 2003, concerns Enron. So not long after, a corpus of corporate emails, over 600,000 of them written by Enron employees, were published for the first time on the intranet. The responsible party was an obscure government worker who was also working at an obscure agency, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. At the time, Enron had been embroiled in a scandal with its top corporate executives under investigation for fraud. According to the Wall Street Journal, the officer at FERC published the corpus, quote, to help the public better understand whether Enron helped to create and then profit from an energy shortage in California during the 2000s, during 2000 and 2001. Now, despite his intentions, the contents of the emails received scant journalistic scrutiny. The Wall Street Journal rebuffed generally the release of the emails at the time, citing privacy violations. Not long after, another journalist defended the publication of the emails for offering a glimpse into the soul, as he put it, of the corrupt organizational culture at Enron. Still, the publication of the emails failed to generate waves of coverage in the press. Journalists did not seem to have the capacity, much less the desire, to trawl them for reportage. And indeed, perhaps part of the problem back then, and perhaps it's still an issue, but less so, is that many of these leaks entail email. As a genre and source of information, email poses thorny problems for inquiry and sense-making. Aside from inspiring nearly universal dread among those of us forced to spend huge chunks of our day writing and responding to email, very little else is uniform or universal about the information it contains. It's wily, it's polyphonous, it's sprawling, whether it concerns the number of emails or topics covered, which can include gossip, back-channeling, snark, risotto recipes, business plans, logistics, personal escapades, administrative memos, cat memes, and more. As a medium, it requires serious time, effort, and steely patience to comb through a large batch for reporting. With the exception of journalists dedicated to long-form reporting, reporters are hardly afforded the liberty to wade through mounds of email. So I think this kind of helps explain why it wasn't kind of obvious/compelling to use this material. So as part of my genealogy, I now want to turn to anonymous, and I have to give a little bit of background. So between 2003 and 2008, the anonymous collective name was largely used on anonymous image boards, largely for trolling, pranking, and hijinks. The pivot to activism would occur between 2008 and 2010. In this era of 2003 and 2008, you have a few cases of anonymous image board users, some who identified themselves as part of the troll army, others who did not, who started to do a bit of hacking and leaking. So one of the first instances concerns radio host Hal Turner. He was pranked by Anonymous for various reasons in 2006, 2007, in part because he was a racist radio host. He then sued 4chan and other anonymous image boards. And in the midst of this kind of back and forth war between the trolls and Hal Turner, some unidentified hacker, not going by the name Anonymous, took revenge on him, hacked him, and got emails and published them. And what was interesting was that the emails showed that he was also an informant for the FBI. Now, this generated not very much press. some of the information was published on the Southern Poverty Law Center. The next example did receive a bit of press, and it was concerning Sarah Palin, who was running for the president, and an anonymous 4chan user hacked her in the hopes of finding some damning information. But there really wasn't any, but nevertheless, the event itself kind of garnered some press, and so it started to sort of percolate in public consciousness that this was possible. 2009 was an important moment for the hack and leak, because this is really the year that you see two proper hacks and leaks that were quite different. One was a hack against the Climatic Research Unit at the University of West Angelina in England. And the emails were those written by climate scientists, and their release was meant to kind of cast doubt on climate science. Now, what's interesting is we don't know the source of this hack and leak. We still don't. And subsequent to this hack and leak, we didn't see a hack and leak of this kind until 2016. So the other hack occurred by anti-fascist hackers against Holocaust denier David Irving. The emails were given to WikiLeaks. It was, again, a small scale affair, didn't receive too much press. And I think what's interesting about these two is that they inspired almost no one to copycat them. Even future initial anonymous hacks and leaks, which we're going to get to, happened without reference to them or knowledge of them. The second case we eventually found out was done by Jeremy Hammond, and just keep that name in your mind because I'm going to return to him. So 2009, you have these two occurrences. They're not really part of any kind of at least known political movement. Between 2008 and 2010, you have Anonymous moving away from trolling and starting to engage in activism and hacktivism. And they're not doing hacking and leaking. They're doing sometimes hacking. They're doing a lot of distributed denial of service attacks, but they're not doing hacking and leaking. But an important operation did occur in the fall of 2010, Operation Payback, where they basically were supporting the cultural right to share. They were supporting pirates, and they were doing a lot of DDoSing, distributed denial of service attacks against the copyright industry and its supporters. One target was a law firm called ACS Law, which was an anti-piracy law firm based in England. And they basically, Anonymous just did a big DDoS attack against them, but the technical people at the law firm misconfigured the email server when they put the website and their material back up. And so Anonymous was able to take the emails. They weren't trying to look for them. They're just like, oh, look, they're here. They took them, they put them on Pirate Bay. And then this is really important. By this time, you have a very sophisticated tech journalism beats, and some journalists from Ars Technica in particular waded into the emails and wrote kind of very damning stories about the law firm. So for example, the emails showed that the firm falsely accused people of downloading pornography, or that parents were sent threatening letters because their kids had taken a bit of copyrighted content. Ultimately, the consequences of this email disclosure was pretty direct, as they were substantial. The government levied fines against the firm for its poor security and failure to protect sensitive personal data, and the firm was also forced to close. From ACS Law leak onward, hacktivists became more aware that publishing exfiltrated digital content could serve particular political aims. In this case, defending ordinary people from aggressive anti-piracy corporations and sleazy law firms working on their behalf. Although it had been possible to self-publish information online or send material to existing whistleblowing sites like Cryptone, mailing lists in existence since June 1996, by this time, it was a bit easier for technically minded activists to upload and publish large data sets on sites like the Pirate Bay and WikiLeaks, the latter billing itself to journalists and the public as a site dedicated to nurturing journalistic exposure. This was no doubt crucial, especially since Assange and his organization courted such controversy. It too signaled to all sorts of actors, whistleblowers, and hackers that leaks were welcomed. Here's an instance where I do think the technical existence of an infrastructure did facilitate the hack and leak, but by no means simplistically drove its genesis. Now, what happened next was really important because basically in December 2010, about 2 months after ACS leak, there was a banking blockade against WikiLeaks, Anonymous, DDoSed PayPal and MasterCard in support of WikiLeaks. And this was important, at least for the purposes of my story, because this was really a moment where the hacker, long, very important politically, became geopolitically significant. Really, they were just showcased in the news left and right nearly every day. So anything that WikiLeaks or Anonymous was doing was kind of circulating in the public sphere. Soon after this DDoS campaign against WikiLeaks, Anonymous gets involved in the Arab Spring, first with Tunisia. And in fact, some of the hackers involved in this campaign explicitly tried to get emails from the Tunisian government. They failed, but nevertheless, now it was explicitly part of their tactical repertoire. But then there was another major hack and leak that was accidental, insofar as the hackers who hacked HB Gary were not trying to find emails for the purposes of whistleblowing or disclosing corruption in the company, but they ended up doing that. And so let me just briefly explain what happened. HB Gary is a security company with someone called Aaron Barr. He went to the Financial Times and told the journalists who published a story based on this information that Aaron Barr knew the identity of the anonymous hackers involved. Anonymous one evening decided to enact revenge against HB Gary and Aaron Barr. They hacked the company, they took the emails, they deleted everything in the company, and then they published the emails, not thinking there'd be anything substantial in them. But even though the HB Gary emails were procured through the handiwork of hackers hell-bent on simple revenge, there was very damning information in the emails. HB Gary was proposing to basically smear journalist Glenn Greenwald in order to kind of smear WikiLeaks, since Glenn Greenwald at the time was a big supporter of WikiLeaks. They were also trying to maybe implant false information to WikiLeaks to discredit it. So they were basically doing privatized disinformation against activists. And this hack and then eventual leak, again, not done deliberately, but for revenge, received massive coverage. There was a spotlight placed on HB Gary, and eventually the CEO of the company had to resign, and the company basically shut down. Now, what's interesting was the hackers involved in HB Gary really enjoyed this hack, and they, in the aftermath, formed a new subgroup called LulzSec and kind of broke away from Anonymous, and they went on a 50-day hacking spree. But the 50-day hacking spree was mostly to show the sorry state of internet security and not to kind of find information to leak. And it was also because they were kind of having a good time. And so eventually, after this 50 days of hacking, and again, they did a lot of leaking, but not of the sort that was meant to unveil corruption. It was more like, here's a data breach, and this company has terrible security. After 50 days, they disband. But right before they disband, there is a hacker by the name of Jeremy Hammond, who was, again, one of the first hackers to deliberately kind of hack and leak. And He was not part of Anonymous because he was on probation for different forms of hacktivism. He had done a couple of years in jail, but he was so excited that there was a group of people doing hacking and leaking that he couldn't help himself. And as LulzSec was disbanding, he joins Anonymous. And then basically he takes this group and reconstitutes it into a very deliberate hacking and leaking crew that was going after shady security companies, police organizations, intelligence firms for the purposes of sabotage, but also to get emails to then take it to journalists and the public. So by this time, really what had been a kind of scattershot practice to hack and leak really consolidates and is cemented. And indeed, under Operation Anti-Sec, which was an anonymous operation, you really start to get massive, massive, massive coverage of the hack and the leak. But what's interesting is that in 2012, a lot of people get arrested, and it's not really clear whether this tactic would continue with the sort of dismantling of Anonymous. But really, there was a kind of turning point, because even though it had sort of been the sole province in this period of Anonymous, others started to copycat it. And you see groups in different parts of the world, initially hacktivists, and then nation states adopt this tactic. So one of the first groups to do it that is sort of loosely affiliated with the concept of Anonymous is LulzSec Peru, who I think it was in 2014, they hacked, well, various entities, but among them was the Peruvian government. They found emails, they published them. They were very damning. They were so damning. There was a lot of evidence of corruption that it almost led to the demise of the Peruvian government. So then you also had a hacker by the name of Phineas Fisher. He was once interviewed by Vice, and he said, well, you have to represent me as a puppet. So there he is. This entity, group, individual, we don't know, has hacked various organizations, and one organization and company that they hacked was Hacking Team, which is a kind of security company in Italy. And basically there had been some research around them that they were selling spyware to dictatorial regimes. And Phineas Fisher's hack kind of proved this. So this is a reporter who wrote, before Phineas Fisher broke into the servers of Hacking Team, we already suspected, based on extensive and detailed research, that they were selling spyware to oppressive regimes, but his hack gave us the ultimate proof. And then Hacking Team lost its license. Then there was other turning points where you start to see kind of nation states take on this tactic. Nation states always hacked other nation states, but didn't tend to publicly dump documents or emails in the process. And so a first instance of this we see is with Guardians of Peace, who is probably working on behalf of the North Korean government. And they hacked Sony Pictures. And then the big kind of very famous one was an ostensible hacker, a hacktivist that no one believed was a hacktivist, Guccifer 2.0, who hacked on behalf of the Russian government against the Democratic National Convention. And so basically you have now hacktivists, nation states, and ransomware groups who are all doing this, and now it's very common. And so now, with that very brief genealogy in place, it's very sketchy. So if you're interested, I do have a written version of the paper that has a lot more details. But now what I'd like to do is finish with the implications of this. Like, why does it matter to locate the provenance in this history? So to finish, let me start with two questions. Why is it important to settle on the provenance of the hack and leak and trace some of its travels and mutations as it settled into other domains? And how will the hack and leak be more widely remembered and memorialized, especially given its multiple afterlives, as it no longer lies in the sole province of hacktivist territory? Now, perhaps it's too early to tell how public representations funneled primarily through popular and journalistic accounts will settle. But so far, journalists, scholars, and security researchers rarely acknowledge the role of anonymous. And they basically tend to think that the tactic predates this ensemble, or others kind of cast it as simply arising due to digital infrastructural conditions. I do believe the stakes involved in projects of historical remembering and forgetting are high, and we should indeed try to understand and commemorate how political possibilities are formed. To get a sense of some of the broader political stakes, it's instructive to return to the earlier example I raised concerning the Citizens Commission to expose the FBI. It might be surprising to learn how absent this event remains in journalistic and public consciousness, in spite of its monumental role in creating a space for journalists to publish stolen documents. As the first journalist to write on the documents, Betty Metzger reflected in a 2014 interview, this dramatic leak was not only overshadowed by other incisive events of the day, one might even say it was forgotten. So this is what she said. Well, when you look back on it, it's clear that it was an important block in what got built as a new approach to journalism, but it certainly isn't what people remember as the cause of a change in journalism. It's just inevitable that the unfolding Watergate coverage that led to the resignation of a president, that's what will always appropriately be remembered. And so she was interviewed in the year that her book on the Citizens Commission break-in came out. Once the statute of limitations was over, she wrote a really wonderful history on that event. So while I don't necessarily agree that it was inevitable that the Citizens Commission event was overshadowed, I do understand why these two other events, the Watergate and Pentagon Papers, were remembered. And indeed, the Pentagon Papers and Watergate have weathered the storm of time and forgetting, largely for how journalists honed in, especially on the latter event. They now stand as iconic and historical flashpoints, remembered not only for what they revealed, but how they helped engender a more adversarial strain in American journalism. So I like this story because I'm concerned that just like the Citizens Commission to expose the FBI was kind of forgotten, even though it was so monumentally important for creating new possibilities in journalism, I am also concerned that Anonymous's role in the hack and leak will also be displaced. So to make such histories, whether the Citizens Commission or Anonymous's role in establishing the hack and leak widely known, I think it's important because it can expand the map of political possibilities. Losing such histories also means losing an archive of political possibilities and the conditions under which actors decide to take on enormous risk for the sake of political change. In some cases, as with the Washington Post and the editor Catherine Graham, it's a reminder that individuals and institutions had to make deliberate choices that went against the normative grain and helped set into motion, in this case, a series of investigations that eventually and directly led to the curbing of FBI power. In the case of Anonymous, the emergence of a new political tactic was more fluid and experimental, but no less consequential. That something so obvious today was so not obvious 20 years ago, even among those hacking, should prompt us to really take seriously that we are limited by our mental maps of the present, and we should nurture spaces and practices as a way to think beyond the obvious. Finally, for those of us, so now one last implication, and then I'm going to be done. I think for those of us who are committed to both teasing out sociological and technological causes and factors in our analysis, I still think we face the question of where to put our causal accents and explanations. Do we zero in on infrastructure, technological affordances, and other technological determinants or drivers? Or do we put the accents on social, cultural, economic, and political dynamics and context? This choice, of course, should not be treated as a binary. It really depends. And I would say it often depends. It often only becomes clear through kind of historical examination. As Langdon Winter put it most succinctly and compellingly decades ago, social construction and materialist approaches to technology are, in his own words, complementary, a position echoed and instantiated by scholars hailing from very distinct traditions and epistemic starting points, such as Donna Haraway or Bruno Latour. Still, attributing agency or analytical weight to a technological condition or artifact rather than a social factor is much easier said than done. It is rarely a straightforward or obvious exercise. I think that it's really important to do what I call kind of recursive microhistorical work, where people who work in the present, who are not historians like anthropologists or media scholars, I think it behooves us to kind of return to topics that have passed and return to them, after 5 to 10 years, precisely to ask new questions. And also because I think it gives us that temporal distance that we need that allows us to more clearly see whether a factor in the constitution of something new is more social or more technological. Indeed, one reason I hesitated to attribute too much of the internet's influence or even hackers' technical skills to the rise of the hack and leak concerns an absence, which I opened with. To reiterate what I raised earlier, hackers had the technical capacity to hack and leak in the public interest as early as the 80s, but especially from the 1990s onward when email became more common and the hacker underground experienced a boom. They were owning all sorts of systems, but they didn't engage in this kind of action. Again, most of them were not ideologically disposed, but there were hacktivists who were also breaking into systems who were ideologically disposed. The imagination to hack and leak was spurred on much later and relied on just the right conditions. The existence of leaking platforms and especially a critical mass of renegade hackers experimenting as various publics watched over the course of many years, allowing others for better or worse to emulate them and engaging in the hack and leak tactic. So that's it for my talk. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Coleman. This is such an original, creative, fascinating story that you're telling us, and fascinating research. I have a lot of questions, but I first want to remind our audience that there's a Q&A box here in the Zoom, and that I can introduce your questions to Professor Coleman. But I will start myself. In this genealogy that you're creating, trying to understand and explain this passage from the hack to the hack and leak, I wonder what historical role you attribute to the culture of social media, because I've noticed that there's a historical parallelism there, right? You're talking about maybe 2009, 2011. This is perhaps the peak of Facebook, right? When it started to grow massively. And I couldn't help to think about two things here. First, the movie, The Social Network, right? Which tells one story, perhaps fictional story of the origin of Facebook. And it starts with a leak. It starts with a hack and leak, because there's the idea that the creator is hacking Harvard database and leaking these images to create social media, right, for the first time. And then I also thought about a piece by Wendy Chan and another colleague that talks about the habits of leaking and how being on social media has this quality of constantly leaking yourself because of the culture, not as you were just reflecting, right? It's not necessarily about the technology, it's about the culture that's created surrounding the technology, right? So I wonder again, what do you see could be the role, the parallel role of social media in this story or this passage between the hack and leak?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks also for bringing all those examples to the table as well. It is extremely crucial at two levels. I mean, anonymous, and in the talk, I didn't quite have time to go into this, but it's certainly the case that in prior moments where you had small hacktivist crews who were mostly DDoSing and doing website defacements and other actions, they didn't have a large scale audience, right? And with social media, especially with Twitter, Anonymous had just, I mean, really hundreds of thousands of people following them, right? And they were really good at social media as well with their videos and their images. And so, you know, I think of Irving Goffman a little bit, who has a nice kind of characterization of like the back room and the front room, and a lot of kind of hacker activity, even today and in the anonymous era and in the past, occurred only in the back room. There was no front room to perform what they were doing. And social media absolutely changed that, right? And I think also, I mean, and just, you know, another interesting type of whistleblowing, which doesn't have to do with a hack, but nevertheless is so indebted to social media, something like, you know, things like the Me Too movement, right? Where individuals who might, you know, individually say, okay, this is going on, and tell their immediate public, their university. And that doesn't have much impact, but once it scales through the hashtag, wow, all of a sudden it really has these massive consequences. So I do think that social media is a big part of that story and one of the important technological moments. Even though I think, use the essay more to think about the non-technological moments that are important to this history.
Thank you so much. Actually, one of my other questions, but I'm going to let other people speak, of course, was going to be about cancellation culture, because I think everyone's talking about cancellation culture right now, and they don't make the connection to the culture of hacktivists, right? Which, I mean, I cannot help to see the connection there. Yes, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So we have a question from Facundo Suenzo.
Thank you, Mora. Thank you, Professor Coleman. This was a wonderful, very enlightening presentation. I was also really thinking about like the invariance of emails as a material, like I don't know, thing that was common like across your genealogy, like because I was thinking that I have two questions related to this. The first one is like how these means for communication have readapted to protect from leaks, from hacks and leaks, because it's like it's like it seems like silly that still like a lot of things are happening like in written pieces like emails, and like how obviously how like hackers have developed strategies to think in other ways of like getting into data. And also I was thinking you mentioned these issues of surveillance, and also like I was thinking in Foucault in the idea of the will to know, right? How we really want to know more everything, and all the time we want to have more knowledge. And how do you think that this culture that you define has also created possibilities for the states and companies to surveillance citizens? So how would like, if this is an intended consequences of like this movement, the hack and leaks movement, into how now we are like more willing to be surveillance in some way because it's part of the culture? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, great questions. You know, for the first one, I think it's so interesting because, yeah, a big part of this story is the weirdness of email as a genre. And I think of everything from like Pablo's work on information abundance, right? It's a really good example of that, to the fact that it's very hard to work with, but people have historically committed things to emails that maybe they shouldn't be committing to writing, right? Which is why, for example, with the recent hack against the Mexican military, you know, it's not new information. It just like confirms what was known, suspected. And I know that, I think, first of all, a lot of individuals and institutions do know that because things can leak, whether by an insider or hacker, a lot of individuals don't commit things to words in a way that, or email in a way that they absolutely did and did not think that there was ever a risk in the 2000s, right? Because people weren't hacking and leaking or leaking. And so I suspect that there's a lot more restraint. That said, you know, because of the fact that we are dispersed, email is so common, it's part of our everyday infrastructure of work, people are still writing things in email that they shouldn't be writing, right? And so it'll be interesting to see, again, how long it might take for people to stop using email for things that they feel like can be damning once exposed, because I do think that's a kind of possibility. In terms of the second question, I think I'd have to think a little bit more about it. What I do think is interesting about this is that, you know, states and corporations have had a lot more power to surveil groups and individuals than vice versa. But I think what interests me about this tactic is how a relatively small group of people can, you know, expose a lot of governments and corporations without that much kind of work, right? And so it kind of shifts the power balance. And this is something that like Phineas Fisher and other hackers themselves have also relayed. And also what's interesting in this history is that while Anonymous was very experimental, and a lot of what they discovered was accidental, the hacktivist groups have become much more deliberate, and none of them have been caught, you know, which is also interesting to think about, that they've sort of definitely have learned from their predecessors to be more surgical and careful in the execution of the hack and leak.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Coleman. We have a question from Fatima.
Hello, Professor Coleman. Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is about how the hackers themselves, you know, are whistleblower. Increasingly, they are performing sort of a journalistic role as well. Of course, they send the materials that they hack to the journalists as a source, right? But at the same time, they're doing it on their own as well. And I remember this concept called journalistic interlopers and WikiLeaks, and how they're becoming, you know, performing journalistic functions as well. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the case that I think that they are performing journalistic functions. They're central to journalistic practices, but because they're hackers and lawbreakers, I think that journalists are sometimes very uncomfortable with acknowledging that, which again is why I'm maybe so persistent that no, I know you may not like it, but indeed they're central to what you do. And in fact, I mean, to your question though, you know, again, I wasn't even thinking about this question myself. I took the hack and leak as very obvious. I was like, well, of course it happens because there's hackers, there's information. It's like, you know, it's just going to happen, right? But there was this moment where a journalist contacted me, and it was a journalist who worked at a top US newspaper, and basically they were like, Biella, I'm working on a topic. And it would be nice if hackers knew I was working on this topic, because maybe they'll go and hack for me. And I was like, oh my God, you cannot like parlay this. This is super illegal. What are you talking about? And then after, like, you know, I sort of put him in his place, because that really is dangerous to sort of seek a hacker to get material for you. I was sort of like, it's just like a gift, you know, it plops on your desk, but don't go seeking hacking help. I was amazed. I was like, oh, wow, now journalists are thinking about their material vis-a-vis hacking, right? And I was like, okay, there has to be a history here. When did they start thinking about this? And this is when I started to actually investigate the question, like 2 weeks after that phone call, right? And again, I think hackers have fundamentally changed journalism. And of course, I think WikiLeaks is recognized as changing the journalistic game, although because, you know, and understandably, a lot of people have issues with Assange and WikiLeaks, and also because, again, Anonymous and other hacktivists are breaking the law, I think sometimes there's also a discomfort in acknowledging their role. So part of my project is sort of intervening in that space and in that reluctance, because I do think that they have shifted journalistic practices and norms so fundamentally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Biella, for a fascinating talk. I have a lot of questions myself. We are running out of time, but there is one question from the audience that I would like to pose as a way of closing, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It says, did you ever consider the role of play in your work? The attitude of the hackers, as you have mentioned in your earlier work and in this presentation, makes me think about Huizinga's discussion of play as a concept meaning, quote unquote, non-seriousness, while also being, quote unquote, very serious at the same time.
No, yes. And I love that you raised that. And I do think that, I like to juxtapose the Citizens Commission example with the hack and leak for various reasons. And in the longer essay, I elaborate a little bit on this. With Citizens Commission, you had a group of 7 people who very deliberately, and I would say non-playfully, got together to execute this break-in. And the same with the Washington Post. There wasn't a lot of kind of play, but seriousness. And I think that really matters. And it's an important example of, intent and risk-taking. But I also think, and this is to the point of that the hack and leak in some way was so unimaginable, even among people doing hacking and getting access to email, that I think we need play and experimentation precisely to whip up new possibilities, right? And hackers are really, good at play and experimentation. And that doesn't mean that everything that follows from that is necessarily a social good, but I do think that we are trapped by our mental models, right? And to escape them requires at times experimentation and play. And that's in part why hackers often do create novel things, whether it's a copyleft or the hack and leak or blockchain, whether or not we like it, right? That attitude of willingness to experiment and play is so central to their craft and to the political possibilities that follow from their craft. So thank you so much for asking that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you for a fabulous presentation. Thank you to Maura for great moderation and for everybody who's attended and stayed so far with us through the end. I want to wish everybody rest of your days, and see you on Thursday for a new installment of the seminar series. And again, Biella, thank you so much for sharing.
And thank you, everyone. And thanks for those great questions as well.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.